Well, the backdrop for the story we're going to look at today is actually very interesting. God's people, as we will look at in a few minutes, I'm going to break it down for you by chapter, but God's people are being threatened with extermination. I find it interesting that the Jewish people have many, many times in their history been threatened with annihilation. Then, a man by the name of Haman, which we'll get to him shortly, he gets his feathers ruffled because he didn't like something that Mordecai did. Again, we'll get to him in a minute. And so he decides that he wants all the Jews put to death. So he places a really strong incentive on this. He basically says that if you're in the Persian kingdom and you kill a Jew and their family, you get to keep all their possessions. But God, working the way He does, in mysterious ways, placed 2 Jews in strategic positions, in strategic places that would eventually save the people from calamity. Through a series of events, with God in control, of course, Mordecai serves the king at the king's gate, and Esther becomes queen of Persia. So let's break it down. Let's look at how this all develops. It's a great story. We're going to go through the story, and then we're going to pick up about 5 different things that we can learn from this story. And that'll be real quick at the end. In chapter 1, we see that King Xerxes, and yes, it's the same King Xerxes supposedly in the movie 300. I think, movies can kind of make things a little outlandish, but it's the same supposed historical figure. Well, he throws a party to end all parties. This party was 180 days long. That's a long time. Do the math. That's a long party. Now, he was doing this for really one purpose. He just wanted to show off his wealth, his royalty, and a lot of other things. And at the end of this 180-day party, he has a feast, a 7-day feast. And as you can imagine, King Xerxes and all the people who attend this banquet, they are drunk out of their skulls. And so in his drunken stupor, the king wants to show off to all his drunk friends his beautiful queen, Vashti. So he sends for her to come to the party so he can show her off. But guess what? She refuses to go. Well, this angers the king, but more than that, it sends a ripple effect throughout the entire country. All of the advisors of the king say, we got to do something about this. But do you know what they were worried about? They were worried that if the other women in the kingdom saw what she did, they'd start doing it to their husbands and wouldn't respect their husbands. So it was obvious something was going to have to be done. So they removed her as queen for her act of insubordination. Then we move into chapter 2, and King Xerxes is suggested by his advisors that they got to replace the queen with someone else. And so they devise this plan to have a beauty contest. Now, all the beautiful women are going to be prepared for a whole year in what I'll call beautification school. They go and they eat the best foods so they can get them nice and healthy looking. All the perfumes and all that stuff is done. So they have a beauty contest to discover who the most fair in all the land would be. Now, in the city, there was a man by the name of Mordecai. He was the cousin of Esther. And he raised her when her parents died. So keep in mind, he is her stepfather, but also his cousin. And Esther was very beautiful. Now, her Hebrew name was Hadassah, but her Persian name was Esther. Now, why do you think they gave her a Persian name. You see, when they were rounding up all the beautiful women in the city, they just grabbed her, took her off against Mordecai's judgment. And that's her dad, so to speak. So he's really worried about her because she's a Jew. What if they find out that she's a Jew? What are they going to do? So anyway, it goes through, and after 12 months of beautification, the ladies were finally presented to the king, and as you can imagine, it was love at first sight. Esther stole the show. She had actually become the favorite of the guy who was helping the women get healthy and beautiful and all that stuff, because she was such a humble person. Well, he immediately chooses Esther to be the new queen. And behind the scenes, we learn that God was preparing Esther for a higher purpose. Now, at this point in the story, we don't know what that purpose is. But we just know that God is always at work behind the scenes, preparing for things that would happen in the future. Mordecai, Esther's stepfather and cousin, would frequent the king's gate because he was concerned for his cousin/daughter. Remember, they just kind of took her. So he's concerned about her. So he goes to the king's gate to get as close as possible in hopes of just gleaning a tidbit of information along the way. Well, one day, while he is at the king's gate, he overhears two men plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. Well, Mordecai's a faithful citizen, so he immediately gets word to Esther. Esther gets word to King Xerxes. And at the end of the day, King Xerxes' life is protected. The treasonous men are put to death. And eventually, this story, up to this point, is recorded in the Persians' Chronicles of the King. Now, that may seem insignificant now, but just understand that's a very important thing. So just remember, Mordecai saves the king's life, and it's recorded in the Chronicles of the King. We're going to come back to that later in the story. Then we move to chapter 3. And in the meantime, there is this ambitious man by the name of Haman that is working his way into the good graces of King Xerxes. He is probably the number one noble in all of Persia. He is highly respected by King Xerxes, yet Haman was not a very good person. Haman was placed in a position of authority, and he loved the fact that when he would walk down the streets, people would bow to him, to honor him. That is, everybody but one person. Mordecai, being a Jew, would not bow to anyone except God. And so when Haman would walk down the streets and Mordecai would see him, Haman would get very upset that Mordecai didn't bow down to him. And so he began to hate not only Mordecai, but all the Jews in the land, because they served the same God that wouldn't allow them to bow down. So he thought, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to trick the king into forming an edict throughout the land, and his ring will seal it. And once his ring seals the edict, it cannot be undone. So he tricked the king into putting his seal of the ring on the edict that all the Jews, in several months in the future, but a day will come in the future when all the Jews will be put to death, and if you put them to death, the incentive was, as we said earlier, you can have their possessions. Now, do you think anybody might get a little excited about that? Sure. They probably had some pretty good wealth among themselves. And so this was the edict. So nothing but bad came from Haman. Well, in chapter 4, we kind of get to the climax of what's going on in Esther. This is where Mordecai, once he realizes that there's an edict out there to destroy all the Jews, he becomes flustered. He becomes upset, just like every one of the other Jews would have. He's very concerned about what's going on. So he sends message to Esther requesting her to go to the king and request and plead that the people be spared. Now, there were two problems with that request. Now, we can't understand the problem until we know the culture that they lived in. As it turns out, anyone who came into the presence of the king without his request took their life into their own hands. Did you know that the king had a gold scepter? And if someone came into his presence that he did not welcome, they would be put to death. Pretty strong penalty, right? But if he saw a person that he respected and he wanted them to be in his presence, he would extend his golden scepter to the person, which would say, "You can come into my presence and let me know what it is you request." So, anyone who would come into the king's presence without his permission could be put to death. The second problem with this request was that if she went and asked to protect the Jews, someone might ask, "Why are you so concerned about the Jews?" To which she would have to reply, "Because I am one." And we don't know what the response would have been to that piece of information. So Esther, when she got the message from Mordecai, was pretty afraid for her own life. That's when Mordecai makes the wonderful statements of verses 13 and 14, and I'm going to read them to you. Chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Mordecai, knowing that Esther is afraid for her life, sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape." In other words, eventually it's going to be found out and you'll be just like any one of the others. "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." You see, Mordecai knew that God would deliver His people. He always did. He always did in the past. He always has, and He always will protect His people. So Mordecai wasn't concerned that the people wouldn't be protected. He's just basically saying, "Esther, you are in a position where you can do something about this." And he goes on and says, "But you and your father's family will perish." That is, if you don't do something. And then the key phrase in the entire book of Esther: "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Remember that. It's a very, very important phrase. We're going to come back to it here in a little bit. For such a time as this. You see, Esther requested, when she got this message back, she finally accepted what her responsibility was going to be. So she sent word back to Mordecai to spread the word among all the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days. And at the end of that third day, that she would go, take her life into her own hands, and go to the king to make the request. She was willing to risk her life. And she even says, "If I perish, I perish." She really thought she was going to die for this. She took her life into her own hands. Now, isn't that the kind of commitment that we, as God's people, need to make? If I perish, I perish. But I'm still going to do what I am here to do. I'm going to do what I have been called to do for such a time as this. Consider Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of Daniel chapter 3. Let me read 3 verses to you. It says, "King Nebuchadnezzar," this is the 3 of them speaking to the king, "we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing fire, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if He does not," get that? "Even if He does not save us from the fire, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." They were prepared for a time such as this. And they acted accordingly. For time such as this. Well, we then move into chapter 5. Finally, the day comes for Esther to appear before the king. And he immediately extends the golden scepter to his lovely, beautiful wife. And he says to her, "Why are you here? And what do you want?" He knew she was there for something, right? And he even said, "I'll give you anything in my kingdom up to half the kingdom itself." He was committed to give her pretty much anything she wanted. Well, she said to King Xerxes, "My request is that you attend a simple banquet tonight for you and Haman. I'm going to prepare a banquet. Y'all come to the banquet, and there I will make my request to you." So the king and Haman came to the banquet. The king approaches Esther once again and says, "What is it that you want? I'll give you anything you want up to half the kingdom." Well, maybe she thought the time wasn't right. But in response to that, she really wasn't ready to make the request. So she said, "I request that you come to another banquet tomorrow, and then I will make my request known to you." Now, this is where it gets interesting. The king goes to bed that night wondering what it was that Esther wanted to ask him. What was the request? So he couldn't sleep. And so, to go to sleep, he asked one of his eunuchs to read to him the Chronicles of Persia. Now, what was recorded in the Chronicles of Persia? Remember I told you earlier, when Mordecai saved the king? That little tidbit of information was in those Chronicles. And I'm assuming he just wanted to hear some history to help him go to sleep. Is there any better place to fall asleep than in history class? Now, I love history. I probably would never fall asleep in history class, but it would help him sleep. And when he came to this part of the story where Mordecai the Jew saved his life, he said, "Well, wait a minute. What was done for this guy because he saved me? Was there anything done for him?" And the eunuch answered the question, "Nothing was done." Well, he's frantic now. He's like, well, why in the world would he not have been rewarded for what he's going to do? So the next morning, he's thinking to himself, I got to think of something to do for this brave man who basically saved my life. Well, remember, they're fixing to be going to another banquet. Haman is going to be coming along, and Haman is one of his trusted advisors. So he sees Haman approaching, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to ask him what he thinks we should do for a person of honor." So he has this meeting. In fact, let me just read this to you. Esther chapter 5. This is when Haman is headed to the banquet. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. Now, why was Haman so happy? First of all, he was a trusted advisor of the king, but the queen had invited him to a banquet the night before. No other nobles were invited. And now today he's going to another banquet, and she's invited him again. He is one important guy. That's why he is happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai once again at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Calling together his friends and his wife, Haman boasted to them about his great wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had, and I'm reading from Esther, by the way, and how he had elevated him above all other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet that she gave. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that nasty scoundrel, mean old Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." And I ad-libbed a little bit there at the end. So he was so obsessed with killing Mordecai that he erected a pole 50 cubits high, 75 feet in the air, that he was going to ask the king, since he was a special person to the king would grant any request. He was going to ask the king to impale Mordecai at the top of that 75-foot pole. He thought he was going to get this all done. Well, Haman had decided that since he was so special that this would be his request at the banquet. However, chapter 6, when Haman came into the king's presence, the king wanted Haman's opinion. Why not? He's one of his trusted advisors. And he said, "What should I do for a man to be honored?" Now, can you imagine what Haman probably thought? I'm going to be honored. So since he's asking me what I think should be done, I'm going to elaborate, and it's going to be some kind of special. So Haman immediately thinks it's him that's going to be honored, and he says, "Well, I'll tell you what I would do. For a man of honor, that is. I would dress him in one of the royal robes that the king has worn. I would place him on a horse that the king has ridden, and I would lead him around town as one of the most important people in all of Persia." Well, the king thought this was a fantastic idea. And in chapter 5, verse 10, he says, "Go at once. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate." Now, can you imagine the picture? Haman is prepared to ask the king to put Mordecai to death, and yet the king wants to honor Mordecai. I think Haman probably thought to himself, I might want to tread on this a little lighter than I thought in the beginning. So he wanted to receive the honor, and he wanted Mordecai to be put to death. But all of a sudden, the king says, "I want you to do this for Mordecai." Then we come to chapter 7, where Esther has her second banquet, and King Xerxes, Haman, and Esther are all present at the banquet. The king asks her, "What is your request?" "I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom." And Esther replies in chapter 7, verse 3, "If I have found favor with you, and if it pleases you, grant me my life and the lives of my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." King Xerxes asks, who is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Now, can you imagine how quiet the room got? And all of a sudden, Esther points to Haman and says, "This is the man." The king was upset. He flew off in a rage. He is so upset. He is angry. He is upset with Haman, and he doesn't know what he's going to do with this guy. But then one of the king's eunuchs pointed out that Haman had erected a pole 50 cubits high, on which he intended to impale Mordecai. And so the king ordered Haman impaled on his very own pole. Finally, the edict to kill the Jews could not be overturned. Remember, once the king sealed it, it was still going to be done. But a new edict went out that the Jews could protect themselves from any calamity that came their way. And that's exactly what happened. And every single one of the Jews was protected and lived through that event. What a story. That's a fantastic story. Well, from this story, we can learn a few lessons, and I'm going to share those with you just quickly. Behind the scenes, God was preparing Esther for a life-changing event. And what that tells me is that God is always at work behind the scenes to prepare you for such a time as this. God is always at work. You see, everybody says, how many of you have ever prayed, "Lord, what is your will?" Anybody? Sure, everybody's prayed that. Well, you want to know what God's will is? Just open your eyes, look around, see what God is doing, and get involved. Because that's what God's will is. That's how Jesus lived every single day of His life. He'd go from one town to the next. When somebody came running up to Him, "Heal me," He healed them because that's what God wanted to accentuate and reveal who Jesus was. So behind the scenes, God is always working to prepare His people. Another lesson is Mordecai told Esther that if she didn't act, God would deliver His people, but through a different means. Keep this in mind. God wants you to do something. You may or may not do it. God's bigger than you. He doesn't need you. He'll get the job done with or without you. But if you decide not to act, you will miss the blessing. You and you alone will miss that blessing. If you act appropriately, you will receive the blessing. But if you don't, the blessing will go to someone else. A third lesson. When Mordecai said, "For such a time as this," he was talking about the opportunities that only God can put before us, and we must take advantage of them. I have zero doubt in my mind, zero doubt, that every single one of you here today is being prepared for a time such as this. I don't know what God's going to want you to do when that time comes, but I know it's coming. And when it comes, you need to act faithfully and perform the act as He is requesting. A fourth lesson. Our commitment to Him doesn't always, but could include a life and death situation. And if it does, do not be afraid to act, because the Lord will protect you. Now, why would I say that? Why would I say something like that? If I truly believe that we could be in the last days, then doesn't it stand to reason that persecution is on the horizon? And if persecution is on the horizon, doesn't it stand to be that our lives could be put in danger? It's crazy how we see persecution all over this world, even today. A time can come where your life could be put in jeopardy. But don't let that make you afraid. Remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't afraid of the fire, and neither should you be. Esther was not afraid to lose her life. Neither should you be. Please act according to faith when that time comes. And finally, humility. Remember, Haman thought he was going to be honored, that he was going to get the honor among honors, but it actually went to someone else who deserved it. No matter how much you get blessed along the way, always remember, God really doesn't need you. He's just blessing you, and you should be thankful for it. So remain humble is the message that you have here. There have been many people throughout the years who have been prepared for such a time as this. What about Noah? Was Noah prepared for a special occasion? What about Moses? Moses was one of several children that was supposed to be put to death, but he was placed in a basket down the Nile River, and lo and behold, who do you think picks him up? Pharaoh's daughter. And all of a sudden, Moses is in the perfect place to confront Pharaoh years later. What about Samson? Was Samson prepared for a time such as this? What about Gideon? He was the least of the least of the least, yet God wanted Gideon specifically because he was the weakest of the weak. Because when working through the weakest of the weak, God would be the one, obviously, who showed the victory. If you think you're not capable of doing something, just pretend you're Gideon, because God will do something through your life just like He did Gideon. What about David? King David. Many suggest that King David is the greatest king of all time. He's the king that was alive when God made the declaration that your family will always sit on the throne. What about Peter? Peter said, I'm not going to let this happen. And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." And he denied Christ 3 times. But Peter didn't let that get in the way. He still followed Christ faithfully. What about Mary? Or Paul? Or you? Or me? We all have our task to fulfill for such a time as this. Let's bow for a word of prayer.